Hello, everyone. I'm Sandeep Parmar, and it's my great pleasure to chair this event, which celebrates the TIDE project and the work of two of its writers in residence, Fred D'Aguiar and Sarah Howe. Sarah Howe is a Hong Kong-born British poet and editor and a lecturer in poetry at King's College London. Her first book, Loop of Jade, won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2015. She is co-founder of the Ledbury Poetry Critics Scheme, aimed at increasing the visibility of poetry reviewers of color. Sarah's TIDE-commissioned object poems now form part of the World Museum's immersive permanent redisplay of their Chinese ceramics in Liverpool. Born in London of Guyanese parents and brought up in Guyana and London, Fred D'Aguiar is professor of English at the University of California, Los Angeles. His first novel, The Longest Memory, won the Whitbread First Novel Award. His poetry collection, Translations from Memory, was published by Carcanet in 2018. This volume includes Title, a poetry sequence commissioned by TIDE and written in creative response to the project's research. D'Aguiar's latest collection, Letters to America, was the Poetry Book Society choice for 2020. We're also joined this evening by Nandini Das, the director of the TIDE project. Nandini is a literary and cultural historian and professor of early modern literature and culture at the University of Oxford. She has written and presented programs on BBC Radio and television on Cabinets of Curiosity, Shakespeare, Renaissance travel and histories of immigration, and the literature and popular culture of 16th and 17th century England. As many of you will already know, TIDE is a 5-year project investigating mobility, transculturality, and identity in England during the early modern period. The project culminates this year after many fruitful explorations by the research team led by Nandini, who is with us today. TIDE began its journey at the University of Liverpool, where, in collaboration with the Centre for New and International Writing, which I co-direct, 5 writers in residence were chosen from across genres to reflect on and to respond to some of the exciting lives and objects unearthed by TIDE's research. Fred and Sarah are both joining us today, appropriately from different sides of the globe, to discuss their own commissioned pieces on transculturality, belonging, and writing about the material resonances of objects held in museum collections, as well as some of these lives that the project has discovered. These poems have been made into poem films, which we'll be watching shortly. But Fred and Sarah also hosted a virtual workshop, encouraging writers to respond to objects from the period that TIDE's research focus covers. And some of these poems can be found, in fact, on Twitter, I believe, under the hashtag Speaking Objects. So go look at TIDE's social media if you can and read these poems. They're really rather wonderful, so do check them out. And we're going to, in fact, I think hear perhaps 1 or 2 of them as well. So before we watch the films that have been made based on Sarah's and Fred's poems, I want to invite Sarah and Fred to join me now and just to ask them a little bit about the workshop, in fact, that they led, and to maybe give us a sense of those Twitter contributions as well.
Hi, hello, hi Sarah, hi Sandeep. Thank you for the introduction. Sarah, would you kindly go first?
No problem at all. Yeah, this workshop. So I guess our idea for it was that it would be a great way of encouraging a wider universe of people to get involved with writing these poems if Fred and I could be seen live facilitating this workshop with some real live participants and poets. So we were lucky enough to have a bunch of talented poets, some emerging, some already fully emerged, who all were very game and got together and watched these wonderful videos created by the curators at the various museums and institutions that have partnered with us on this. So there were objects from the National Portrait Gallery, from Liverpool World Museum, Oxford Herbaria, many others. And we were just encouraging them to think about what it is to try and write in the voice from the perspective of an object, to commune with the past in that way, to reconstruct lost histories and piece together fragments. Fred, what was it like for you facilitating the workshop.
Yeah, you know, it's so good, Sarah, to work with you and to work with a group in a studio setting. The workshop before Zoom was always seen to be an in-flesh thing. And what I discovered from the Zoom with people brought together in this electronic digital space was that it was possible to do a lot more with visual images and exchanges, and then to respond from the place you're in, partly in your response to the things within the workshop. Whereas when you're in the same room at the same time and doing the same things, it's very difficult to have that diversity of place. So I was glad to see that working in the objects. And because it's tied and you get swept up in history, as it were, it was good to see people engaging with the objects and giving them a life, because they seem to be still and without biographies. And yet here they were being talked about as if they were living.
Just to ask, actually, what were some of the objects that, if you remember, that you were looking at? Because I have a sense that some of them are material objects and some of them are they paintings? Are they actual pieces of ceramics? What are they that you're looking at?
All sorts of things, actually. From various different centuries, a herbarium from the Oxford's collection. That's this wonderful crinkled old manuscript full of these illustrations of plants, and as the curator explained, some erroneous labels that reflect the understanding or lack of understanding in that period of the sexual reproductive parts of plants. Salt cellar from Sierra Leone, very intricately decorated piece. A pipe tomahawk, extraordinary thing that something could be at once sort of peace pipe for sitting down together and an axe. We got some fantastic responses about this sort of double-faced, Janus-faced object.
Yeah.
As well,
yes.
The one that we wrote about. Fred, do you want to talk about that painting?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, Sarah, it was really nice to use the tomahawk peace pipe, which is used formally between groups talking who have to get along or else there's war. It was actually nice to use it as a warm-up object in a friendly setting, in a creative writing setting. So that was really great to see the object move sideways and take on a new meaning, and yet very fruitful. Our painting was really, again, critical. The title of which I kind of got to pull up because it's longish. Oh no, we're going to see the film a little bit later on, but it says it's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Portrait of an unnamed African girl, and Louise de Querouaille, Duchess of Portsmouth, and it's painted by Peter Lilly in 1671. So it's that picture, which is fantastic. It's got so much going on. We had a wonderful time with it, which I hope you'll think is wonderful when you see what we did later on. But I thought that was great because I spent so much of my writing life dealing with historical objects that were passively seen, and then here we were once again enacting that in a way that was taking a chance.
I mean, objects are really gifts for poets and writers, aren't they? I mean, it's a chance for you to step outside of yourselves, of your own voices, to transpose or transfer yourself into something else. And the objects that you're looking at have these complex, fragmentary histories. So was it interested in that kind of workshopping process? Did people feel that they had to kind of sympathize or step into the object as a thing or an entity, or did they sort of handle it with language? How did it work?
They were great, weren't they, Sarah? I thought everybody took a chance. First of all, there's something vulnerable about having to write on the spot. So I was really glad that everybody played along, because especially when you know it's being recorded, you think, oh, this is not like the usual workshop where it's anonymous and it's over in 2 hours. This is actually going to be down and recorded. So people were really good about jumping in and just responding. Some people had some great things that seemed to be considered way before the workshop in the way they responded, the pressure of their speech. And that made me think about how we come to a workshop, that we bring our own histories and practices anyway. And sometimes if you're used to contemplation and so on, you actually go into that mode and you're already editing yourself as you write. And that came out. I was glad to see both the raw and the considered side by side.
And this is something that came up in our discussions during the workshop with the fantastically perceptive and imaginative participants, thinking through this sort of balance between channeling the object's voice like a sort of medium, and being just a conduit for what you imagine it would say, or sort of going to the object because it allows you to say something that you need yourself to say, because it allows you to speak to some preoccupation that goes deep into you. So and I suppose the ethics of all of that as well, which I guess might come up a bit later when we talk about the collaboration Fred was just trailing there. But I mean, Fred, you were quite right about the visual aspect of the prompts, though it makes me think back to the conversations we had right at the start where we were sort of brainstorming this workshop together, when you said, oh, I'm a bit hesitant about this because when I accept a commission to write about objects, the first thing I want to do is go into the museum and pace round it, you know, and see it from every single angle. And so I feel a bit hesitant about taking on something where I just see it as a 2D flattened reproduction. One of the things that we said to the participants was the idea of trying to write about these objects as if we were endowing them with a nervous system, which I guess is extra challenging when you don't have the tactility. When I was working on my commission with the World Museum in Liverpool, I was able to, you know, go handle the objects, turn them around with gloves, feel the textures on the mottled terracotta horse through the latex. You know, how does one conjure the sensual sensuous existence of an object when one can't be in the room with it?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's one of the things yes, that's exactly right. The first thing you do is abandon your ego, and you abandon your lyric self, whatever that might be, and you walk towards the object in a real way of trying to join with it on its own terms as much as you can, given the limitations of that. And I kind of, this is probably why I like historical writing and writing around myth and objects from history. It's because it affords opportunities for this splintering of the self, and then its negation, and then something else emerging out of that interaction, which you're hoping to be surprised by, you know, as you know, from your lovely response in your own writings, and in Loop of Jade, your book, which had, you know, a sense of kaleidoscopic circling of a subject and all kinds of inventions around that. And I think the other thing too is this idea of a reality that's given. You do feel that the second you go for the real, you are into the arena of invention anyway. So that whatever that real might have been, it's gone the second you put a sentence down about the now, never mind the then or before. So I do like the sense of the workshop created of disappearance and disappearing selves in exchange for a communal risk taking and something coming up that might be good for all of us.
Well, I guess that raises Fred, what you're saying there about, I guess, time and the relationship of the self to the present, and the past through these objects. And of course, TIDE is really bringing through the writers in residence you into a dialogue with the past, and how I don't know how you feel or felt in looking at these objects and thinking about that past, or how the experience of the workshop maybe was an opportunity to bring the present to the past, or the past to the present. I'm not sure exactly how that works in that deflection of the lyric self, that deflection of the individual concern onto something that feels perhaps timeless or remote. I wonder if there was anything that came up in the workshop around that.
Not Sarah will help me out here, because it was a thing. Two things were happening, I think. One was that the workshop threw up things to do with the dynamism of us being together for the first time. And then the second was there were these familiar tropes when you engage with strangeness or something that's far from you. And I guess a third thing that seemed to relate to it for me was how people try to bring it into their present. Yeah. And I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does.
Directly. It's partly, I'm in grief too that TIDE is coming to an end, because it's we've been swept up by it and authenticated by it in so many ways because of our writing life, my writing life, And,
Yeah.
and I'm speaking, that it is something you do, and to have a project and Nandini and the crew, in a sense, come to us formally, there's a kind of light bulb moment of recognition, because you know that's your procedure and one of the things you do. So in a sense, the workshop and even the films that the people are about to see, it's all about this process that we're engaged in perpetually and infinitely, until death. That has to do with a sense of myth and history, and then the technology as well, and multiplicity of voices, and our sense of, and for me too, I mean, I don't want to say everything in one go, but I will say one more thing. It's this idea of living in a moment where things have come back that I thought were long settled.
Yes.
And to have, especially having just coming into a new administration over here in the US, it's still finding its feet, of course. But to have those things come back in a really crude way, when you think they were solved, once again puts on the table the importance of imaginative procedures, risk-taking workshops, disappearing selves, multiplicity of thinking, history as a plural notion, genderized notions that are plural and dodging. So it's the everything that creative writing and creative thinking and imaginative writing and the imagination seem to be necessary as an injection into all academic procedures. So TIDE, for me, is, although it's recovering wonderful objects, and it's must keep doing that for us and finding things that are hidden and lost, the point at which the electrification of it comes, not electrification, that's a bad idea, it seems to kill it, to bring it to life, is when the writers are brought in to make those strange passive objects and not seem passive, have histories and biographies, and once again flow in time, in that Elizabeth Bishop way of flowing and flown that she talks about in that Fish Houses. You know what I mean, Sarah, right?
Definitely.
Help me out.
Fred. But bringing the objects into their present. I remember a line, I fear I'll mangle it, that came up in a poem by Nick McCoher that he produced in the workshop. He said something like, exile is not just a metaphor. You know, he was bringing that object right into his present of being a refugee who fled from Uganda as a child, you know, and that object was, you know, letting him express something about that experience, but his experience was also letting him express something about that object. Yeah. And I think that was true of pretty much all the work that was thrown up. But it was so lovely to work in that sort of collaborative mode of throwing ideas around. And of course, we wrote a collaborative poem, but also it feels like the exercise of being, the experience of being the writer in residence for TIDE was so deeply collaborative, intellectually and imaginatively, and the collaboration was always with, you know, the research and the researchers. I think that was what was so special about the prompts that were produced by the TIDE team and by the museum curators for the workshop. You know, that's why we started going sort of round the virtual circle, saying what details leapt out at you from what the curator said, because it's one thing to, you know, just present people blank with a photograph of a salt cellar from Sierra Leone, and it's another thing to hear a curator talk about its story, its life, the journeys it's been on, what it was used for, the fact that it was created for a European market, that means that it's slanted in a particular way for a particular taste. You know, that sort of detail is what we latch onto and seize upon as poets, isn't it? And I think it was the detail that the National Portrait Gallery's curators drew out of the painting in their description that I think made it such a rich experience for us to write about, and many of the participants who chose that object too.
I like very much the example from Nick's poem, Sarah, there, that the life, or the idea of a life and an object, in a sense, almost occupy a similar kind of resonance in this sort of creative or imaginative space. And there's a great deal of overlap. And I suppose that naturally leads us then to your films that you've made, because of course, Fred's film is based on a life, and Sarah's, yours, is based around an object. But in a sense, there is a kind of a question there about singularity and universality, and that kind of wider timelessness of voice in both. So now would be a good time, I think, to watch your films.
Stepney, London and Commissary Court, London, 1632. Grace, a blackamoor presented by church wardens for living incontinently with Walter Church, Stepney. Walter promised me a warm bed, food, and his unwelcome attentions. I promised him nothing. At first, we slept back to back, and in our sleep, we turned to face each other and hugged for warmth, I believe. The utility of a hug that grew into something sweeter. I referred to him as unwelcome attentions from that day to our last together. They dragged me into their court, said I had sinned. He stayed out of the frame. They said my crime was that I slept with him, not his for inviting me. If only I could wash him off my skin, I would wash myself clean down to my bones. But he stays with me, after soap and water, his smell and his embrace, his breath rapid as his body tightens, and he says, "Girl, I love you. Stay with me." And I say, "Thank you, unwelcome attentions." And we fall asleep, back to back, wake in a full embrace.
Stoneware dish, Long Chuan kilns. Admiring this fine green glaze might bring to mind a lichened mountain pine. Undertones of green and jade ringed like tiny moons along its darker side. Or the travellers among you might think of the desert aloe, its pale spines picked out by starlight and by camels bound in caravans, scenting hidden veins of green across the empty sand. Once upon a time, dishes of my shade were known as celadon, named for a shepherd in a French romance sporting grey-green ribbons. Others say it's a garbled echo of Saladin, who 1,000 years ago dispatched 40 greenware pieces fired in far China as a gift for the Sultan of Syria. Later, the Ottomans prized us at imperial banquets, since in the presence of poison's slightest drop, it was said, such vessels would begin to sweat or split apart with a terrible crack. I remember the pomegranates that bled their ruby drops across my face, the heads that rolled. Thanks to my vigilance, the Sultan outlived every single meal, until the Silk Road's midnight cactus trail led me deeper west. I too am a survivor.
It's really wonderful to see them side by side, actually, and to sort of get a sense of the resonances between them, of which I think there are many. But I'd like to ask, if I can, perhaps Fred and then Sarah, for you just to kind of reflect a little bit and tell us about why, these objects or stories were interesting to you, and reflect on the process of writing, if you can.
Yeah, I should say that D'Aguiar and who read my piece, the actor, that was, if you didn't see the credits clearly, that wasn't me, and I wish I could have done a better. I couldn't have done a better job, actually, because she really does embody that note that is there of the woman who's arrested. I like the sliver of the note. It's a real invitation in for me, because there's so much missing. So it was very easy to walk into the life, and then to see where it led, and to assume a kind of sensuous guide in the biography, but not allow it to colonize the subject, which is a danger. If you're writing and you're on a roll, you can easily overdo it and repeat the very sin that you're trying to write against, which is how colonizations work and hem you in. I wanted it to more open up vistas rather than shut things down. So I kind of enjoyed it as a way, and I thought the film, Helmi's interpretation, just made me think of it in ways I hadn't quite visualized. So the film once again opens something else that the words couldn't have said, in addition to the words. And also it makes me realize how filmic so many poems are. If I could have a library and be forever a Tide associate, the new Tides would be to have endless movies of historical objects, where you have the number of poets respond to them in simple ways and straightforward linguistic ways, and then invite in a true spirit of collaboration, filmmakers. Then one step further, get musicians to score it. Why don't we just do this thing where we say, Tide is forever, and it never ends, and just in a true spirit of how we operate anyway in our flesh and blood realities, that we do enjoy music, painting, and so on, and see if we can create a museum. And it's not really a museum; then it becomes a living thing, really.
Fred, I wanted to ask you that as a follow-up there, because of not knowing the original material that you received, I wondered about how much of it was interpreted, and how much of where the voice comes in, where you bring in and respond to the silence of this character Grace. And also, of course, I guess there's something about seeing contemporary people voicing this very old story that makes me think it must have been perhaps the case that you were reflecting on kind of race relations across the 20th century, across your century, across the 21st century. And I wonder how, again, thinking about the past and the present, how that relation then, how that works in terms of your voicing of this character.
Yeah, I mean, the temptation is not to try and sound and bring antiquity to bear on your contemporary interpretation, to assume that the language of contemplation is just what it is. It's how and so that's the first thing. Don't get trapped by registers that change with time, but give that person a contemplative voice, because that's what bodies do. And then the second thing is for me, is to assume that a trauma from the past isn't lost to the past, but can be embodied through identification. And it's not me. Hartman writes about it. The guy at Yale has written about it quite a bit. This notion that through the Holocaust, he talked about, well, they weren't there. Why are they feeling this way? Well, there's something called generational trauma. Well, if it's a long time ago, how do you do that leap and that quantum identification? The imagination does it. It's almost involuntary, and especially for me with this notion of justice and playing on my mind and my writing. If I see somebody in a line and you just barely name them, you know nothing about them, and they're lost, I immediately incline towards the injustice, and I immediately want to say, come forward and speak. The microphone is yours. Give us your body and your time, and let's get you back into wholesale dimensionality that you're robbed of by being silenced.
Well, of course, much of your work as a poet and as a novelist as well engages with these kinds of silences and these voices and these histories that are that need to be brought to light. And you have that line in this poem, which is about kind of the going to sleep back to back and waking in a full embrace, I think, as I'm kind of mangling it. But I wondered if that was a sort of a hope or a sense of optimism, hopefully, for the future of how perhaps some of the very, very complex, racial issues, identity issues that we're struggling with in all of the countries from which you hail, I suppose, in this kind of very transcultural existence that you've had. Did that feel like a way to kind of speak to the future as well as the past and the present?
It might be, yeah. I'm glad you said. I'm always glad you say things like that, Sandeep, because it makes the work look, like it's doing important diggings. I think the thing is about going to sleep is that you don't want to go to sleep. You don't want the pessimism of defeatism to be the end of what you do. So there's an Afro-pessimism, Afro-futurism vibe in the work, in that one is, begins, you think, look, history, it defeats you, it's too big a tide, as it were. And then the other is a futuristic one, which is a little bit some optimism in it. And you think, well, you know what, you can surf that tide, there are ways into it. And so I tend to begin with the realism of that terrible space to go to for something, and then try writing in imagination as a recuperative gesture to come out with something that can be offered to children. I also want my kids to read it. I think it can't be too bad. I mean, what are you going to show them? You have to be able to show them something that will show them, your journey and what you did with the material that was apparently so distressing. And the possibility, which I can't predict, of that gesture and imaginatively, is that you hope a reader will then take that. Actually, it's the Olympics right now, so we'll take the baton of what you've passed on and run with it in that relay as a reader, and remake it once again with the same kind of energy that you've put in. And of course, and that thing is the ego thing, which I've said before, this idea of egolessness, not because it's not anti-lyric, it is anti-lyric, with the ego at the center, always domesticating everything. It's this notion that if you didn't do that, something else might turn up. And what is that other thing that turns up, especially when you're facing histories that are unfairly tilted towards the conquest?
That's a nice segue, in fact, into thinking about Sarah's poem, which is this, really about how the lyric can flatten or can not flatten, but sort of smooth over surfaces. And what Sarah's poem is doing is really looking at these smooth surfaces and trying to find those cracks and fragments and resonances. So, Sarah, if I can turn to you and ask you about the process of these ceramics and how you chose this stoneware dish, and tell us a bit about the poem.
Oh, I love what you just said, Sandeep. Gosh, that was so much better than what I thought I was doing when I wrote the poem. I suppose this poem is part of a suite of 6. It's the last poem. I guess I wanted to use the 6 to say different things about the journeys that these objects have taken. So this one was very much about mapping out the path of the Silk Road, I suppose, and what the sheer difficulty of bringing these very fragile objects thousands of miles across mountains and deserts from China, first to the Middle East, where they were prized in their own different ways, and then eventually to Europe. So this poem, I guess, was all about sort of cultural mishmashes and imaginative projection. So I guess the reason I was drawn to this celadon dish was, though this didn't actually come out until I started discussing the poem with Andrew, the filmmaker, that I think part of the reason I was intrigued by it was because of the idea of celadon as being this green that we refer to as celadon green, right? And is it a green? Is it a blue? What is it exactly? How do you pin down the color of this glaze that is named for these objects? And I think I sort of had in mind, the sort of research in linguistics across cultures about how different cultures define in their language the boundary between blue and green, and that was hovering in the background somewhere. But I guess I also became fascinated by the sort of lost, buried, irrecoverable etymology of this word celadon that we have in English, which might come from French, it might come from a sort of pastoral romance, or it might possibly be a sort of Chinese whispers, and I use that metaphor advisedly, garbled echo of the name Saladin, you know, that we just don't know. We can speculate as historians. So I guess I felt like that word and its journey was emblematic of the sort of misconstruals and reconstructions that we go through in trying to talk about the journeys that words make, that people make, that objects make down the centuries. And it sort of was part of the conception of the whole suite of poems, really, that I was talking about the dialogue with the TIDE researchers. Behind the 6 poems was very much the resource that the TIDE team have been putting together for the last few years called Keywords, which is doing just this, thinking about the histories, the etymological twists and turns that are words that we still use, like foreigner, like stranger, like home, have taken, that they we were dealing, Fred and I, in these poems with historical periods where ideas like race, as we understand them now, aren't construed, aren't formed in quite the same way. So, you know, we have to be aware of those differences, and thinking about the ways that those words have changed in their meanings since from that time to now was, for me, a really helpful way of crystallizing that distance.
Well, I suppose I was going to ask Nandini Das to join us at some point to talk about the keywords, and I wonder if maybe now is a good time to bring her in fact, to tell us a bit more about that. Nandini, can I ask you to talk a bit about the commissioning program and the keywords?
Absolutely. Fred and Sarah, when both of you joined TIDE Project very early on, we were still wrestling, I suppose, with these terms. TIDE itself is an interdisciplinary project, and that means we come from various different disciplines. And one of the things that we realized very early on is that when it came to the simplest terms, and sometimes the simplest terms are the trickiest, I suppose, the simplest words we use every day seem to have hidden depths that catch us by surprise. When it came to those simplest terms, we were not always on the same page about what we meant by that. So I might, as a literary scholar and an immigrant woman myself, I might talk about the word stranger in 2 different ways, perhaps, whereas our legal historian would sit back and frown at me and say, but stranger did not mean that at all. So partly TIDE keywords came out of that conversation, our attempts to figure out the different perspectives, the different points of view from which you could walk around and look at and engage with a word. And how people have always done that, and particularly the 16th and 17th century, kind of get slightly perhaps ignored in our current discussions about those ideas of migration or belonging or identity, because our attention and our world is so deeply shaped by empire. So it's inevitable that this earlier period, when Britain still is a far more minor player in global geopolitics, does not get that attention. But there were terms, these words, and lives caught up by those words were still simmering in the background at that moment. So that's what we started excavating, I suppose. And, you know, Sandeep, just to flag up, also, our discovery was that the more we got caught up in the words, the more we got pulled in by individual lives, sometimes fragments, like the Life of Grace that Fred kind of, you know, encountered within our research. I remember still, Fred, you and the TIDE team talking about the frustrations of those little slivers of references to these slippery lives.
Yes. No, and this is partly why TIDE is doing such wonderful work, because you set up a whole geometry for writers to walk in and grab hold of and try and find shapes for those, what apparently chaotic and unfinished forms. And the sliver of it is exactly what you need as a writer. The more information you have, the less you're able to say. So in a sense, finding fragments, it's like Gilgamesh, you know, where's that bit that's missing? You know, you have to bridge the gaps. You do what the historians are all doing anyway. You're making shit up, as they say. Sorry, excuse me. But not only that, there's an intuitive power to the imagination. I should say, I mean, let's be formal about this. There is an intuitive power to the imagination, which is a property. And I think writers and poets, you know, we're trying to say that. We're singing about something on behalf of a way of being in the world that we feel needs to work alongside other material forms of knowledge and so on. And so TIDE is great in its multidisciplinary approach. I was so glad to be working with Sarah, because looking at Loop of Jade and rereading the book, it made me think about when autobiography ends. Let's say you have a parent and you don't know her antecedents because she was, you know, adopted. What do you do when you're really trying to enter the space through a family history? Immediately Sarah gets to work and she produces a book full of, you know, fruitful invention, fruitful bouncing off and into realms that only the imagination could have authenticated. So I was so glad to reread that book, and then for us to go to our painting and work. And I think without TIDE, I don't know that we would have collaborated, because we're so busy and an ocean between us, etc., etc. So it's great how that bubble, there's a ferment in those relationships, and then there is something that comes out of it that you know I'm quite proud of. My back is turned, if you would.
And we'll look at that in a moment. I wanted to actually just pick up on Leaf of Jade, actually, Fred, that you've mentioned so generously there. Leaf of Jade is a book that I love and teach every year. And the poem that I always focus on, students really find extremely fruitful. It's about an object. It's the first poem in the book about the jewelry box, where the jewelry box becomes this way of encoding a kind of silence, and it's a sort of family situation. I wonder then, Sarah, if I can ask about sort of picking up on what Nandini is saying there about keywords. You know, and you have in your film poem this fragile object that's being transported. Well, language itself also becomes a fragile and transportable object, which is, you know, filled in various ways. And so there's a kind of lovely resonance there anyway in your work. Specifically, though, about your rewriting of Borges's Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, it's a mouthful, where there are lots of objects, and this is a kind of fake taxonomy. I wonder if there for you is a usefulness of objects where emotional kind of human language fails. So it's not just that objects are speaking, but it's almost like taking up a space where language is not really able to go. Does that make sense?
That really makes sense, Sandeep. And you've sort of reminded me, I think, of why I, when TIDE first brought me in as their second writer in residence, I really could have done anything. And I very quickly narrowed in on objects. I've been fascinated by Chinese ceramics for years, and I sort of knew that I wanted to rootle around in that area. And I think it was coming out of Loop of Jade and that jewelry box, and the object in that gives the book its name, which is the bracelet that a baby would wear while toddling, made of jade, as a sort of talismanic, protective one. And at the end of that poem, the speaker imagines the bracelet shattering and what that would mean. And I guess the fragile object that shatters or is put that time is wound back so that it can be put back together again really became a pretty crucial image in this suite of poems. Another of the 6 is about this blue and white kraak dish named for the Dutch ships, named for the ships in Dutch that would have transported these porcelains across the sea. And I sort of imagined that dish. We don't know the provenances of many of the objects in the World Museum in Liverpool because in the Blitz their records were destroyed in a fire that burned down most of the museum apart from its facade. So in that poem I was sort of imagining this dish that was being transported when its ship sank off the coast of Goa. And so this dish imagines being dredged up from the deeps and surviving this wreck, a little bit like the museum building that it lives in now, where sort of much of the collection and all of the records went up in flames that night in the Blitz. So it's sort of, yeah, it's all about fragments and objects and how they might survive and be able to say something that feels more immediate to us as we hold them in our palm than perhaps language could, but they're also mute, so they're sort of reliant on language to tell their stories. So I think I'm fascinated by that bind between the tactile but mute thing and how you bring it into language.
It also occurs to me too, Sarah, that you're not only a poet, you're also a scholar of this period. And so you're dealing often, I guess, with kind of manuscripts and text and that becoming itself a kind of object, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, definitely. I guess I have tried to write about the experience of being a scholar working in a rare books room in the past. I'm not sure many of those poems have made the cut in my work, but yeah, it's definitely something I'm interested in, the material reality of encountering printed and manuscript texts from the past and what it is to read them in their original incarnations and sit in a slightly chilly refrigerated room while, you know, turning their warped and buckled pages.
Now might be a good time actually for you to talk about your poem and share your wonderful collaborative poem with us. I'm going to hand over to you and let you do that, if that sounds good.
I think that we have the text of the poem that we can maybe bring up. I think we were actually going to flip this round. Maybe I shouldn't say, so we'll just read it. But Fred, I feel like you should introduce the poem. Would that be all right? Can you set up? We've already heard a little bit about the painting, but since it was your idea that we should do this, and I'm so grateful
my fault
that it was, yeah.
Well, what I like about this is that there are two figures, and there is this unequal power relationship in the painting. You can see it just in terms of how they're situated. And then there's some objects around them, which the curator talks about. So we had a lot to go on. And immediately I thought, okay, two major voices, let's distribute them between us. And I wasn't interested, because I've already written about a Black woman in history. I really wanted, and I wanted to try the other voice, the white woman's voice. So I expressed an interest in that, saying, I want to be her. And that didn't even leave much room for Sarah's. You have to be the little girl. And then we knew there would be a dialogue between them, only because it's suggested in the way they're pushed together in that painting. And that was for me, a fertile place to start, because it allowed for us to do so much.
Okay, I think if we could see the text now, I'll start to read. I wanted child named what, placed on my left. I'm right-handed, but painter arranged us for light on my skin, gleam in child eyes and teeth, my pearls strapped to her neck, pearls that take from child my hint of a blush on my cheek, from my hand on child, her leaning on my lap, so warm, flesh of my flesh, perhaps pearl.
If I could speak, my voice would be the twist of this coral, branching and snapped. My voice would spill from a slit belly, a caviar of pearls.
It hurts to admit, words fail me, paint fails for me, music works only as long as music lasts. The minute the score ends, all the words and the paints that worked for me disappear. I am a lady of some standing. I tell all that to the child after I ask her if she can keep a secret, and do not wait for her reply.
I would tell you, lady, that all I have is secrets, secrets lent to me by others, not leaning in as you might to a friend, but absent, glazed, speaking to someone I can't see. The secret, the exact shade of my smile. Another, lost to the ocean's rolling damask folds, my true name.
The water behind us is the sea between us, the skin shades that separate us, the shared sex that binds us.
We wear a single set of pearls, your own. We know what it is to be passed between men. We sit in silence behind this frame. We are not at all the same.
I am a decorated shell no one listens to, for me, save you, for that sea sound takes you back where you are free. We are coral and pearls, taken, that won't be put back in their current beds.
If I could speak, I would call you what I would call you, ma'am. Who would I call? Ma'am, are you my ma'am now? If I could speak, who are you, mama? Are you my mama now?
Wow, that's incredible.
It's a
I think
road
it's
show.
good to-
We're going to, Sarah and I will take off in a little mobile somewhere and go to galleries and just invade objects. And
I think, yeah, there'll be a prize for that somewhere. That's amazing. It's wonderful. Well, it's really moving, really, to hear the poem and to see the image, because you've done something, almost impossible, I think, with that poem, which is to not apportion blame, but to really think emotionally behind each of the figures. And of course, back to kind of thinking about the lyric, I was very drawn to the I that becomes the we, and the relationship between the I and the we and the you, and how the pronouns tease out this ethical relationship between the figures in that painting, but also the way we might see it. So I'm just going to let you sort of talk a little bit through about how you thought about some of those issues and others.
Sarah, when I sent you something, I didn't try to think, let me leave an opening for Sarah, nor did I try to block you. I didn't think, stop Sarah from speaking. I just did the best gesture I could make towards the piece. And hopefully that gesture would be something that you would, and you did, take up. Does that sound fair to you, that I threw something, you threw something back?
No, it really does, Fred, but I suppose I did find this a difficult poem to write, albeit collaboratively. I think that you created the best possible opening, really, but I was sort of discomforted in various ways, and it's good to be discomforted, isn't it? But this is certainly something I would never have attempted were it not for your sort of prompting and encouragement. I think I would have decided from the off that trying to write some words for this little girl was not my province, but I think that because the whole poem is a sort of shared gesture, I was able to try and do that. But I think that it's also really interesting how the poem evolved as our ping pong back and forth went on, right? That it's a dialogue between the two figures, but it's also sort of not a dialogue between them, because it's not really clear how much of it is voiced, how much either party is hearing things that are said aloud, or if it's just all happening within their own minds. I guess something that shifted for me, and that I think shifted in the whole poem, was I was very uncomfortable about trying to imagine an actual realistic voice for the girl. And that's something that I suppose I moved into by the end, because I thought it demanded it. It's not the sort of realism that a novelist would recognize, I guess. But I was conscious that I was interposing my, poet's consciousness and perceptions in the first few segments, and I think that was almost a protective gesture, actually. I wanted to protect the little girl from my marauding consciousness. whereas you, Fred, you write novels, you know, you're much more comfortable with this exercise. And what was so lovely about your first few segments that you sent was how they are at once, you know, beautiful lyric fragments, but also really conjure that something that feels like it could be the voice of Louise here. And of course, you move away from that as the poem goes on.
Yeah, there's something about power, negations of power on behalf of some kind of spiritual quest or expression is always a thing that's trying writers and poets, narrative, and novelists and so on. You're aware of a power dynamic. You don't want to recreate it. And you hope that in language, you supply something that will, if the scales are tipped as they are in that painting, both are trapped, as we know, by the times. But the power dynamic is so tilted in favor of the woman with her hand on the owned child's shoulder, that immediately you're writing, you're trying to tip it a little bit upwards by giving her something, one interiority that she's denied. And once you do that, you're hoping that will lead to an expanding universe in terms of a reader coming to her sense of being. And then I suppose this idea of allegorizing the soul too, that the idea that if it's denied and it's irrepressibly present, as you know, through eyes and skin and so forth, you do want to find ways to set it going. And I was kind of aware of thinking about you, and I also felt actually confident that whatever I sent your way, you would be able to, you wouldn't be stumbled by it, because you know, you wrote Loop of Jade, you're Sarah Howe, how you know, of course you can handle it. So I did feel that I also need compatriots. I mean, I'm feeling as a Black person writing, if I go into history, I want company. I don't want to go in there alone. I'm thinking, it's a scary place. Come along, Sarah, let's go. So I'm feeling that if the more of us walk into that space, in a sense, the better it is in terms of what will take place. We're unlikely to then, you know, do a power move because we know the dangers of that. We kind of know, and we're wanting something to work on behalf of the subject who's not both people not able to speak in a patriarchal bell jar that they're kind of locked in. That I was so kind of aware of too. So yeah, I loved it too. Yeah.
No, it's so much of that is, what both you're saying is so interesting and so brilliant. And I think what was striking about the image was really thinking about the violence in the image, because it's so beautiful, you know, just sort of the contours, the colors, the caviar of pearls, which comes up in the poem. But it is actually it is partly to do with the power dynamics and the patriarchal bell jar that you're talking about there, Fred. But there is a real sense of kind of danger almost underlying this for both figures, and the risk of speaking, the risk of being having that power dynamic revealed, I think is something that the poem handles so brilliantly, because you're able to have sympathy for both of these figures. Did you feel in the collaborative process of writing that you were arriving at a voice together, or voices together, or that you were kind of bringing your interpretations? Was there a kind of meeting point and if you could describe what that is, I'd be interested to know, because collaboration is very hard. It generally fails, but you managed not to do that.
Yeah, I was like one key phrase from, there are many, but Sarah, when you said it's not it at all. When you said she wasn't being equal in that relationship, she kind of rejects the relationship in one of your key phrases. I thought it was really great that you'd kind of already started in a kind of adversarial way to give her kind of pushback within a frame where she is nullified and neutralized. You gave her that sense of, no, don't get romantic about me. This is not romantic. This is terrible for me. I'm breathing, but barely. And you know, there's all the sort of violence is there, and her agency and empowerment becomes a reality as the language builds. So I did think that how do we return to sites where there is violence and it appears to be vandalized and you can't bear it? Well, you go back because you wade into the sea of language. I'm back in the tide metaphor. you wade into that, and you pick up on those currents because they're present. They may be suppressed, but you're hoping, as we did, So I had a wonderful time, even though I was nervous about it. I thought it had to be done.
I love the way that the two sort of maybe key metaphors, the pearls and the sea, came up sort of first in our chat before we embarked on the poem. But when we were chatting beforehand, you mentioned Carol Ann Duffy's poem, Warming Her Pearls. And I love the way that you picked up right away, Fred, on that detail that Louise's neck is bare and the pearls are on the little girl's neck. And that's sort of a matter of painterly chiaroscuro, probably, the painter's like, I need the pearls to be set against a dark background. But the story emerged from that, but also the sea behind them. When the curator speaks in her video, she talks about the symbolism of that as likely being to do with the English Channel and Louise's status, as a French woman, mistress to an English king, and so the sea has that particular symbolism of traffic between the two countries. Again, a metaphor I use almost deliberately, in the sense that she's kind of traded between men almost. But that it also became, by steps and permutations, the Sea of the Middle Passage.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's hugely successful, I think, is the poem itself. And the contrast, that chiaroscuro, as you're saying, Sarah, that the contrast provides of these two figures is in itself a kind of thinking about collaboration too, that the resistance towards what could potentially in one person's hands be a kind of appropriative gesture, as maybe, there's sort of various levels of that, but in your work, I think you guys have managed to sort of, bring an ethics to it, which is quite remarkable. Brilliant. I wanted to ask about politics, because obviously that's something that's been kind of hovering around, and I know that both of your thinking, you're activists, you're writers, you're very much engaged in outside of your writing lives as well in those activities, and have been in your histories. Is there something kind of more broadly, I guess, about the work that you've been doing with the project that makes you think about the way that politics or political writing can last? Or is there some sense of trying to engage with, in this deep past, which, maybe for those of us who are very squarely thinking about the 21st century and the racial politics of now and the identity politics of now, is there some comfort to be had, or is there some kind of disappointment to be had about engaging with that long period of politics that intercedes between us and the early modern period?
No, but it's clearly, there's a general claim, and help me here, Sarah, the idea that everything you do has some kind of political resonance, whether you like it or not, and it's whether you're aware of it or not. For me, it's with history and a historical awareness. It's a conscious endeavor with the imagination in league with history. And because of my own movements between places, I'm aware of those places being historicized by previous occupancy and current power dynamics and so on. So the poetics is not innocent. It's not roving free of power. It is moored to place, time, and so on. And I love to recognize that from my reading and from the writing. And I think I don't see, I'm not shy about saying these are the political ideas, because I don't think the aesthetics is hurt or bruised by that recognition or engagement. It's just a way of finding an account for it that somebody will accept as a reader or a listener. Quite often there aren't the accounts to go with what it is to be political. As a writer, instead, people lean back from it and say, oh, I don't want that, because they think the crudest expression, manifestation of politics, well, we don't mean it in that way at all. Not if it's a nervous endeavor and a philosophical endeavor. We were clearly in the business of making politics complicated and not simplistic. And to put it into the middle of aesthetics is just a recognition of our temporality, how we historicize ourselves, the insistence on a spiritual realm. to what we do as writers and readers and being, in the world. The inclination towards a fairer justice system, because you're seeing so many examples of, injustices. You can't bear it. I can't bear it. So there is that all the time. And if I'm going to write, I better have something to say. Otherwise, be quiet. It had better be something urgent. It had better be historically aware. It had better take the aesthetics, whatever they might be, and say they're not going to vacuum. Here is their specific gravity, and admit it and work with it. It's difficult. So what?
Yeah. But I guess, Fred, in thinking about your, what you're interested in terms of archival recovery, there is always this anxiety, I guess, perhaps there should be for writers, that if we're not really responding to what's happening now, that the events and the gains that we've had politically now will be lost. So in a sense, maybe, Fred, if it's fair to say that your work is becoming more political in a kind of overt sense, is it perhaps this fear of, not fear, but this anxiety about the gains being lost, or of having to, or wanting to respond to what is happening now out of a kind of sense of urgency that maybe we see lost in the tide, if you like, of the shifting tide of history?
Yeah, it may be a function of old age. he's getting curmudgeonly. No, in all seriousness, there is a sense of things coming back, and conversations that were settled in Brixton, South London in 1980 something, and now once again having to be said again. And so because I'm having to say it again, and there's also that Borges thing about, if you're gonna interrupt silence, you better have something to say, otherwise leave it, be quiet. And I think if there is an urgency to writing, I do feel writers are privileged in something we were talking about earlier, about the slow time of contemplation, the slow time of thought. Especially with the frenetic digitalized world right now, where so much is being flooded and things are being hurried. It might be, and Elif Shabak said something about that earlier in the earlier session with Nandini Das, about this idea of reading and writing as a slow, and necessarily slower time to allow for contemplation, because everything is so hurried. And so we are in this business of having to turn the page, and it takes a while to read a page and fill a page. And if you're going to fill it, you better have something to say. And so I do feel that there is this urgency to it of the moment, but also of the tradition. It's a tradition that can be seen to be in a classless thing, an aristocratic thing, a thing full of cheesecake and so forth, but whatever that symbol is. But I think if you keep the urgency of a class-based unfair distribution of power and wealth, privilege, a planet that's being eaten up, if those things really mean something to you in a practical way, the art might reflect it and embody it in some way. I'm not so sure how, and I don't want to be prescriptive about it, but I do see these things as pressures that are good for writing and good for the imagination. And without them, the imagination might well be impoverished. It might well occupy a vacuum where it's irrelevant as well.
Thank you, Fred. Sarah, can I ask you to respond to that?
Yeah, I have so much admiration for the way that Fred deals with these deeply political, historical questions of collective memory and our recovery and suppression, and the way that voices speak to us from the past. I would urge everyone to read the full poem title in Fred's book, which, I mean, that one fragment used in the film is so beautiful and so moving and poignant, but it shines all the more brightly set among all the different sections. It's so sort of multivocal and multi-centuried and rich, that piece. It's symphonic, actually. It's quite breathtaking. So yeah, do go read that. But I suppose the politics, I mean, I am very interested in politics in my writing, but I guess the political question that these poems, which might not on the surface look at all political, they might look quite staidly aesthetic, was speaking to is that of decolonizing the museum, which was sort of there from the very start in the conversations that I was having with both with the TIDE team, but also with the curators that we were collaborating with at the World Museum in Liverpool. These really visionary curators, Emma Martin and Alex Blakeborough and their teams. They were sort of, we on the first day walked through the then existing collection. It's a sort of anthropological collection that sets out these different objects from different continents around the globe. And then there's one case of Chinese ceramics, which I think is sort of across from the samurai armor and swords, you know. Emma Martin was sort of saying, I think that this display is deeply fetishizing, you know, and it had these old typewriter written labels that sort of gave you this really staid information about where these dishes had been collected from, where they what type of glaze they were in, and you know, we were sort of saying, is this what people want to know about these objects? Is that what's going to grab your modern museum visitor and make them want to dwell on these, rather than so often the experience I guess I have with museum overload of just sort of, you know, glancing and walking on. And we wanted to find a way of recentering those objects. So I guess the first thing we did was to sort of massively reduce the number of them, that now there's only 6 in the gallery. And again, it was sort of like giving them back agency, that they no longer being spoken about by these labels from the possibly as far back as the mid-20th century and not reconsidered since then. But and also that to bear in mind the fact that Liverpool is a city in England that has one of the oldest Chinese communities, you know, that I wanted that to be felt, albeit subtly, in these poems. I sort of walked around Liverpool Chinatown, which I'd never visited before working on this collaboration, and I sort of wanted that sense to come through in the poems, that, you know, that there are people whose histories and origins these objects speak to in a real way, which is why I was drawn to them, I guess. That these Chinese export ware porcelains, often created for a European market and taste in the first place, they sort of speak to the history, the prehistory of people like me, of mixed race origins, first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, that was a way for me of talking about this thing which we call assimilation, or whatever we choose to call it, moving to a new place and trying to fit in or not fit in. And I think that the World Museum sort of renamed the sequence of poems after the line, which is the first and last line, "I too am a survivor," which is much better than the title that I'd come up with in the first place. And I think that title speaks to, you know, the trauma of migration in a sense. So yeah.
As they say, an extraordinary, and you've done such a service to the collections, and also, as I say, to the history of the people who, it's the oldest Chinese community in Europe, I think. And you know, interestingly, I guess that relationship that Liverpool has and that Britain has with those immigrants and with the past, I think that you know, that's something that's still being worked through as well, and we're discovering that some of those people were deported, right? And there's all this kind of complex history. So again, you've really allowed people to have an agency for themselves, looking at those objects and knowing that they have a right to that history and being there, which is great. We're running out of time, and as always, these conversations, it's so brilliant to speak to you both and to hear your thoughts. I wonder if we could get a sense of some of the workshop poems and the Twitter poems, just to go back to the workshop that you've done, to kind of close out the event. Does that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. Fred, you'll remember this too, that one of the first ideas when we were brainstorming in the workshop came from a fantastic poet called Shash Trevett. We were looking at this soup tureen, I think 18th or 19th century, I forget, sort of decorated dish with a lid. But in amongst this finely painted, fanciful decoration is this big gash with these sort of almost brutal metal staples, because that was the way that you would repair a broken ceramic object in that era. And it sort of speaks strangely to the preciousness, that you wouldn't just throw it away, you wouldn't put it in the bin in the way that we might now because they were so difficult to get to Europe. So you'd repair it. And I guess adhesives can't have been what they are now. So you'd put in these big metal staples. And Shash, looking at this object, she said that it reminded her of a female body post childbirth. And that these staples reminded her of surgical staples. So she was sort of talking about the roundness of the belly of the soup tureen with this scar running along it. And she's still working on the poem, but she's posted a fragment from it onto Twitter, which I'd like to read to you. Now across my middle, like train tracks, the metal staples zigzag in fault lines, pulling, stretching, pinching together my cracked skin. So it's great, isn't it? The way that voice is simultaneously scarred woman and scarred soup tureen. And it's the relationship between the two. I move on now. I mean, I could keep quoting from the participants in the actual workshop, but I also wanted to read a couple of little bits and pieces from what's been turning up on the hashtag. So if you want to join in, do go and watch the broadcast, which I think will be up for a bit longer, of the original workshop, and then tweet your writing to the hashtag speaking objects. This is a poem from Gemma Borg, who was responding to the Oxford Herbaria piece. So this is all about the images of plants. Were these herbs proof of the diverse hand of God? Or were the dry shadows a new language, a world incessant with novelty, portraited, loved as slaves were loved, or loved for what they are, green signatures of the wild? Isn't that amazing? Completely awesome, that poem. Thank you so much, Gemma, and everyone who's been sharing your work with us. And last, though I could go on and on, I wanted to read a contribution from who I think must be our youngest hashtag poet so far, the 11-year-old of Claire Feeney, who was writing about the pipe tomahawk, the object we were talking about earlier. So this is pretty darn impressive for an 11-year-old, I think. When ruptured lips go into raptures, awesome, in adoration of their puppet master, yet such an epitome of pleasure, alas misconstrued, may soon shift in disposition. Tarnished blade slits the air, isolates the bloody torso from the neck, therefore severing the spirit, free from material substance. So do join in, everyone.
Fantastic. Those are amazing. Yeah. And then there are more, as Sarah says, on the broadcast and also on the Twitter hashtag as well. Thank you so much, Fred, Sarah, for your thoughts, for your poems, for this incredible conversation that's made us all appreciate objects in ways and lives I think we probably didn't before. So thank you. Thanks so much. I'll hand over to Nandini Das now.
Thank you so much, Sandeep Parmar, Sarah Howe, and Fred D'Aguiar. That was really special. And for all of us collectively from the TIDE research team, listening to that, listening to your conversations, resonated with so many conversations that we've had with you in the past. It felt really moving for us. So with that stunning final session, we are now at the end of TIDEfest, and I hope all of you who are listening from whichever time zone you're in will join me in thanking our three wonderful speakers and also all of those contributors on Twitter who have been posting throughout. So here's to you. Please continue to follow us online at www.tideproject.uk and on Twitter at ERC_Tide. We are now at the end of TIDEfest, the final cultural festival of the ERC Tide Project. Thank you to all of you for joining us over this weekend and for your questions, tweets, and conversation on Crowdcast. For now, before I say goodbye, I would like to invite the rest of the TIDE team on the screen. along with our absolutely stellar tech team, without whom none of this would have been possible. Excellent. So our postdoctoral scholars, Lorraine Working, Haig Smith, Tom Roberts, and Emily Stevenson have been the shaping forces behind this and all of the rest of the events of TIDEfest. I should also thank, in absentia, João Melo, who was TIDE postdoc for the first 3 years of the project and continues to be an honorary TIDE associate. And the person who has held all our efforts together, our project coordinator, Emma Louise Whitehead. Without her, none of this would have been possible and certainly wouldn't have run as smoothly as it has done. Our tech team, the superb Dr. Sam Robinson, Dr. Amy Chambers, and Dr. Peter Good, have made all of this run and handheld us through all the technical pitfalls that might befall us. Thank you. Our understandings of how identities and questions of where we belong and how we belong continue to come under perhaps more pressure from multiple sides than ever before. If TIDEfest has managed to achieve anything, I hope it has reached somewhere near the aim with which we set out, which was to open up a window, not only into academic research, but into the ways in which books and objects, the past and the present, researchers and creative artists, and all of us can work with each other, speak to each other. Fred D'Aguiar said earlier in this session, history is a scary place. I'm not going there alone. I think we all share that. But if more of us walk into that space, who knows what will unfold? So here's to the hope that such travels and conversations continue and are allowed to continue in the future. Goodbye.